Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
All right, well, here I am again for yet another episode of the Examine Life with Phil, and here you are listening, so thanks very much for that. Now, this time around, what I'm going to be doing is a wrap-up episode. I'm going to try to draw together all the various threads and topics that were brought up on all the episodes I've done on the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge. I managed to go back through and listen to all the episodes I did on the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge. There were, probably about 11 or 12 hours of content, so I went through, took notes. I pulled out clips that I think are the most relevant, that represent the views the best, or are the most interesting, salient points, that kind of thing, and I'll be playing some of those as we work through it. And I'm going to try and find some way to come to some conclusions on all this stuff. So before I get into that, let me once again thank everybody who participated, who came on and was happy to argue for their viewpoints and things along those lines, because I really enjoyed these conversations. They were really great. I learned a lot, and it was just really fun having these good conversations. So thanks to Tim, Peter, Alan, Jonathan, and my namesake, Philip, for agreeing to come on and to have these discussions with me. Now, just a couple of other preliminary things before I get into it. I'm sure by now, everybody who's been listening to these episodes knows a great deal about how much I love coffee, because one of the things I realized as I was going through all these episodes is I sure used the example of how much I like coffee an awful lot. I think there was a couple of episodes where I used it 2 or 3 times in the same episode. So if you've learned any one thing, it's that I really love coffee. And another example that I kept using over and over again is something about how if God wanted Paul to write the book of Romans, he'd put him in Rome, so he did that. And I don't know why I kept doing that, because it's pretty widely argued, and I think, well, as much as this can be known in historical, biblical scholarship or textual criticism, that kind of thing, it's generally agreed that Paul didn't write Romans in Rome, and I know that, so I'm not sure why I kept saying that, because that was clearly wrong. So if anybody wants to call me out on that, that's perfectly fine. That was wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through all the episodes I did on PDF here, and I'm going to do it in the order I did them. So I'm not going to do them in an order where I say I think this view is strongest or weakest, or this one is most relevant or least relevant, just because, it's easiest to do it in the order that we did them in, and it's probably a little more fair than me trying to stagger them or evaluate them and put the ones that I think are the best first and the worst last, or something along those lines. The only other point I'm going to make at the start here is that, Philip and I were talking about simple foreknowledge. I tried to argue, and he kind of agreed, that if you take kind of like a mere simple foreknowledge view, that's something that all of these various viewpoints can agree on. Because that's just a very, very broad view that simply says God knows the future and we're free. And pretty much every view can agree on that. Maybe not the Reformed or Calvinistic view, which is the first one I'll get into here, because that was the first episode we had, because they define free will differently. And I'm jumping ahead of myself. That would have been a good segue to going right into it. But the other note I want to make is that there was so much content that I thought was good and compelling. My guest had so many good and interesting things to say, that yet again, as has been the case with all of these episodes on the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge, almost all of them anyway, I'm going to have to split this up into 2. So I'm going to start going through the process of recapping here in this episode, and when I get to about the hour mark, I'll split it up, and then I'll continue that next week, and next week I'll give you some of my conclusions as to which views I find most plausible or least plausible, or, I'm not in my mind currently settled on any one view, but who knows, maybe in the next week or so before I record the end of that next episode, I'll decide on one of the viewpoints. I don't think it's likely, but unlike God, I don't know the future. So, jumping right in, for the Reformed or Calvinistic perspective on the problem of divine foreknowledge, I had Tim Carter come on and give that perspective. He and I talked way back on episodes 17 and 18, and that was the one where my main audio recording software failed on me. So unfortunately, there wound up being an echo on the recording, and I did my best to clean that up. So I think it's listenable, but that's even noticeable now when I'm going back and pulling out these clips. So again, my apologies that happened, but there really wasn't a way to go back to fix it completely. So I took the main point that Tim was making about the Reformed or the Calvinistic perspective here to be that free will should not be defined in a libertarian sense. That is, I want to define free will as you can do this or you cannot do this. And Tim was saying, no, free will is you just doing what you want to do. And that's, so to speak, how that perspective solves the problem. It just kind of admits it by saying, yeah, you're not really free in the sense of libertarian free will. And so I've got a couple of clips of Tim and I talking about this, and I'll just go ahead and play the first one for you here.
They actually mean something closer to what you're describing, where you make the choice and you decide, I could have done this or I could have done that. But there is all these various limiting factors that come to play, and not just like the physical ones that you've described where you can't decide to fly, but there's psychological ones as well. There's ones that are how your parents raised you probably limits some of the options you and choices you have to some degree, and a whole not where you were born, the country you live in, a whole host of other factors like that will limit your choices and then turn around and influence them as well. Like, I really love drinking coffee, so that is something I'm likely to choose to do. But if I smell some coffee brewing that I enjoy, well, that certainly influences me to go get that cup, even though it's something I was already going to do.
So back to kind of the original thing in play here with divine foreknowledge. The aspect of defining what free will is important in addressing this problem, because, like you said, it's going to bring about, well, is there really a contradiction here in God knowing all things and knowing the future and our free choice? Because obviously, if God knows everything that's going to happen, and it necessarily is going to happen, then it appears from that side that we don't have a choice in that. But as we live life, we do make choices, and we do. From our perspective, it seems like we are free to choose what we want to do.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. And even hardcore naturalist atheists who are physical determinists, in that they think everything was physically determined at the moment the Big Bang started, they still act as if they have free choice.
And then here's another short clip where it seemed to me that Tim was trying to make that same point about free will being what we want to do.
But that kind of circles around, and you got to ask the question, okay, well, why did you make that choice? Is it because of your nature, or did the choice develop your nature? And I would argue, and I believe Scripture would argue, that it's your nature that determined the choice. And one text that I'll throw out just kind of to ponder is Isaiah 64:6. It says, "We have all became like one who is unclean, and our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment." And as we look at the text, righteous deeds are being committed, but they're like a polluted garment because of our unclean nature.
Mm-hmm.
So even in doing good, even in good actions, because of our nature, they're still unclean and unrighteous. Even if it's building a hospital and saving 1 million lives, if we are still in a fallen, unregenerate state, those righteous deeds are like polluted garments. They're unclean because we're unclean, if that makes sense.
So it seemed to me that Tim was trying to appeal to human nature and say that, in a sense, It's our nature that makes us do things, that is the reason why we do things. And here's the response that I had to that.
Like you were saying, a yes and no thing, and that I would say it's both. Your nature does, to some extent, determine and influence you, and very strongly, but you also kind of, in a sense, determine your nature. So, what's a example I would just posit is, let's say somebody is continually making bad choices in their life. They drink too much, they do too many drugs, etc., etc. Well, it's very easy for them to get caught in a downward spiral when you do things like that, because your choices build on each other. In a certain sense, you're making or creating your nature as you go through and do all that. And then at a certain point, it gets hard. Well, not a certain point. It gets harder and harder each time you do that for you to, well, not you, but the person in this example, for that person to break out of that cycle, because their nature is being made with each choice they make. And so I would say they're kind of like a cyclical system where the choices you make influence your nature, which in turn influences the choices that you make from then on.
And then here was Tim's response to my assertion that it was a both-and thing rather than an either-or thing.
Of the drug addict that just spirals down and doesn't break free of that. Both are slaves to sin. Both are stuck in a cycle of life because of their nature. And while they are choosing what they want to do, they are choosing what they most want to do, which is governed by who they are. And I know it's really hard to split the two sometimes and see it like that, but I would argue still that whatever person you look at in those two scenarios, they're still not completely free in the ability to do what they want to do, or to not in a libertarian sense. If that makes sense. In a limited, creaturely, slave to sin sense, they are free to choose what they want to do, but those choices are influenced by their nature.
So I took Tim's point to be that because we have sinful natures and your nature determines what you do, therefore you can't be free because your nature's dictating what you do. And I disagreed with that, and then I tried to give a thought experiment to prove my point, and that's the next clip here.
You'd said earlier that you were a compatibilist with regard to free will, which, philosophically speaking, means it can be both be the case that we are free in what we do, and it's determined. And is that more or less what you mean? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, from what I've read about it, I think probably in the philosophical community, that is probably a majority opinion right now, is some form of compatibilism. But I'd want to say that that's not a good position to take, because it seems to me that those two ideas are just obviously contradictory, where you can't be free if you're determined to do something. So a good thought experiment that I think kind of helps demonstrate this is, let's suppose a scientist who's kind of an evil guy kidnaps me, and he puts something in my head where he can decide, well, it's a easy example. He puts something in my head whereby he can, if I'm going to do something that he doesn't want me to do, he can just reach in and stop that. He can change my decisions, which I don't think that could actually happen, but just for the sake of argument, let's say that he can do that. So yeah, he does that and he lets me go, and I decide in the morning I'm going to go get my regular cup of coffee, and I do. Well, the scientist wanted me to go get my regular cup of coffee, and if I had decided not to do that, he would have used that device he put in my head to countermand me and make me go do it. Now, did I behave freely in that case? I think intuitively I would want to say no, because I really didn't have any other choice, because if I tried to decide to not get the coffee, the scientist would have made me do it. And I think that's kind of what our intuition would actually say there, is in that scenario, I'm not free. And what I think that points us to is there's a conflict between having determinism and, that you're determined and that you make free choice.
I guess I don't. I think that analogy somewhat hits it, but misses maybe addressing the problem of that incompatibility. I guess.
How so?
In that scenario, there was a point, and I guess maybe it's just picking it apart, but there's a point where you were acting freely, and there's a point where you were not acting freely, correct?
Well, I would say that just in the one decision example I made, I wasn't even able to act freely. Even though you could say, well, I got the cup of coffee because I wanted to, it would have been impossible for me to do otherwise.
Okay. But wasn't it still a free choice because you chose what you wanted?
Well, no, I hope we're not just going around in circles here, but I think that's the point is, it's not a free choice because I could not have done otherwise.
Okay, you could not have done it otherwise.
Mm-hmm. No matter what happens in that in that example, I have to get the cup of coffee. There's no possible way for me to not get the cup of coffee, which is really not that bad of a thing. I mean, come on, it's a cup of coffee. But the point is, there's no way I can avoid getting in that cup of coffee. I'm not free to do otherwise.
But you still, I guess you could say that against every decision you make, though. I mean, were you really free to do otherwise in any decision? We can make that argument either way, couldn't we?
How so? What are you getting at?
Well, like you make a decision to do something.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know you could have done otherwise?
Oh, okay. I get your point. Yeah. At least I think I do.
Even if there wasn't an intervention by the scientist in your analogy, you would have went after the cup of coffee.
Mm-hmm.
So you still chose what you wanted. I guess I'm missing the point there.
Okay, I think I understand. Let me tell you what I think you're getting at, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. I've heard the philosopher of mind, Daniel Dennett, who generally I don't care for very much for other reasons, but here he might have a point. I think he's made a similar point where he was talking about people on a putting green, and somebody makes a putt and misses it, and then says, what he says is, well, I could have made it. If I had the chance to do it again, I could make that putt. And what Dennett says is, no, that couldn't be the case. And he says the reason why is you could never actually recreate all the conditions of that particular putt and see if you can do it again. That's just impossible. That time's gone. You can't recreate the weather patterns and all this other things. And even if you had something like a holodeck on Star Trek, the time would be different. It would never be the exact same choice again. The adage of you can't step into the same river twice. Is that kind of what you're getting at there? That, well, how could I really know because I can never go back and be in the same scenario and make a different choice?
Yeah, I mean, and that, and I'm not, you still chose what you wanted. I'm just parsing words here, so, more or less.
Okay. Well, I guess, my response to that would be, well, in a certain sense, this is what I thought of when I heard Dennett's example anyway. In a certain sense, that's absolutely true, because we're not time travelers, we're not God. We can't go back and do the exact same thing again. But I think, if you take it a little less strict and a little more general, what we usually mean by that is, well, if I'm in a very similar situation, I could choose not to do otherwise. So in the coffee example, I certainly think it could be the case that some morning when I get up, I could decide not to get my cup of coffee. Now, right. I'm probably not going to do that because I need my coffee in the morning. I have 2 kids under the age of 3. I need it, But it seems to me that I could get up tomorrow and decide, no, I'm not going to have the coffee. And it's never the exact same scenario. Tomorrow won't be the same as it was yesterday or today. but it seems similar enough that I can say, well, that's a similar enough choice that I can say it's kind of alike. It's analogous.
But that decision is still governed by your greatest desire, and you're going to choose what you most desire in that moment, in that scenario.
Yeah, in a certain sense, I think you're right about that. I've even heard people who are pretty strong in the libertarian free will philosophical camp say, when they're asked, well, how do you make decisions? They'll say, well, it's by simply focusing your will on what you want. You think about it and decide what you want and do it. So I don't think you're wrong in saying that people do what they want. I mean, I think psychologically it gets very complicated because often people will say, I didn't do what I wanted. And usually what they mean is, I wanted this, but there are all these other factors that came into play and I felt like I didn't have a choice, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I think you could say that generally, not generally, always people do what they want to in the moment. I don't think that's wrong. I just think that's incomplete. I don't think that's enough for it to actually be freedom.
What would make it free?
If you have the option of doing something else. So I guess to put it in different terminology, if you have the option of wanting something else. So in the scientist example, if I have the option of wanting the coffee or not wanting the coffee, and I can execute either of those two.
Right. Which you have the choice, but you're ultimately going to choose what you most want. So it's that desire that's governing your will, and it's hard to like I said, it's hard to split our nature and our will or our mind, whatever you want to call it, and think of it this way because they're so connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's some people who do philosophical psychology who've come up with some very intense theories as to, well, your will does this, your mind does this, your spirit does this. D.Q. McHenry has a whole book called Philosophical Psychology on it that's a pretty decent book. But I don't know, I've always been kind of skeptical of parsing things out to such an extreme detail like that, because it's very hard to do.
Okay, so if you want the full context of Tim and I's conversation, go back and listen to episodes 17 and 18. Now, it seems to me that the scientist thought experiment I was trying to appeal to there kind of proves that free will has to be more than just doing what you want. And for this reason, and some other ones, I just don't think this is a good definition of free will, as it just doesn't seem to work. I find it philosophically untenable. Now, I don't buy into the Calvinistic viewpoint, which I'm sure everybody listening to those clips or those original episodes could have easily picked out. But I'm going to hold off my critiques of all of these viewpoints as to what I like, what I don't like, and so on and so forth, until I get to the end of presenting all of them, until I get through all of the clips of their proponents saying here, trying to present them and make their cases for them. And in this particular example, I thought that the strongest point that Tim was making in favor of the reform perspective is to say freedom is just doing what you want. That's what free will is. And although he had a lot more to say about many topics, it seemed to me that was the main thrust of his point. So that's why I played these clips like this here. So moving on, the next guest I had on was Peter Razor, and that was on episodes 22 and 23, and he presented us with the Molinist perspective. And loosely speaking, the Molinist perspective is God just knows you so well, he knows what you're going to do in any given circumstance. And I've always thought, and I still think now, that that point alone is pretty intuitively good. There's something about that seems really, really right. I do think that there are some problems that come up later on when you try and hash it out quite a bit more, and I'll get into that more later. But I'm going to get into some of the points that Peter made, and he made one pretty good one here at the start that I really liked quite a bit.
Or a theologian. This is how I explain it to my students, for example. This is the very first thing I say. Just because somebody knows it, or God knows it, or I know it, doesn't mean that I caused it or that God caused it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the examples I always give is, you gave one perfectly, but let me give one illustration that I like to give, and that is my wife. She loves lasagna. Well, I could easily say, if I take my wife out to an Italian restaurant for our anniversary, then she will choose lasagna. Well, if we go on our anniversary to an Italian restaurant and she chooses lasagna, did I make her choose it?
No.
No, I didn't. There's no causal connection there whatsoever. I just happen to know her so well that if I take her to an Italian restaurant on our anniversary, she's choosing lasagna. Now, how much more so considering God,
Mm-hmm.
He knows us intimately in ways that I could never even imagine knowing myself. Not just because he just knows, but because he's even created us. I mean, he has all knowledge. He's created us. He's aware of everything, omnipresent, and all these other attributes that we talk about in theology. So, I mean, this is now knowing me, if you will, on steroids. I mean, that's how God knows everything. And because of that, he has his foreknowledge, and there's no causal connection. So that's how I always try to explain right out of the barrel. Just because God knows it doesn't mean he caused it. There's no causal connection there, and I don't think logically you can make that connection. I just don't see it whatsoever. Just because you have knowledge of something doesn't mean that you caused it to happen.
Now you're making me want to jump ahead to the end of my notes here because I'll say something similar, but I'll resist the. So you would then. So as far as you're concerned, obviously Molinism is the answer to this. So could you I would summarize some of the stuff you've said? Give us your best pitch for Molinism then, before we go to the objections.
Oh yeah, sure. The reason why I think Molinism does a fantastic job is because, at least presently, you and I were talking before we started recording. I believe that there's different ways to answer the question of foreknowledge, God's providence, and human free will. I just happen to think that Molinism does the best answer, and until something else comes along that perhaps does even better, then I'm going to stick with Molinism, and that's how I see it. And so I don't think Molinism is a particular paradigm that thus saith the Lord. So I don't think anybody has to accept Molinism whatsoever. In fact, I would imagine most people in the pew, if you will, never even heard of Molinism. They just think, oh yeah, God knows the future, and they go on with life. They don't think about these types of things. Mm-hmm. But I do think once we start looking at the nitty-gritty here and trying to understand it from a human perspective, I think Molinism does the best. The reason why I say that is because Molinism, in my view, does a great job in God being able to have a plan, being able to have divine freedom, and to create that which he wants to create while still having human beings maintain what we call libertarian free will. He doesn't force us and override our wills. Now, he can, and I think there are particular times that he probably does, and I think we see that in Scripture. There's some points that I think, there were times that he did probably at least influence, override at times people's wills. We even see that with miracles. Obviously, God isn't just letting the physical nature do what it's going to do, all things being equal. I mean, that's what a miracle is. God is intervening directly.
You mean times like where it says in Exodus that God hardened Pharaoh's heart and things like that?
Well, I'm not convinced necessarily that might be a particular example of this, because there's a lot of Molinists who would look at the Pharaoh example of God hardening his heart as being both free will and God. They would see it compatible with Molinism, and that's how they would explain that. And I don't really take a position there, to be quite honest. I think it's possible to explain that whole situation of Pharaoh, his heart being hardened, with the Molinist perspective, because if you look at the text also says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So you got both things going on. You got God hardening his heart, you got Pharaoh hardening his heart. And so you can actually explain that and make sense of it based on Molinism. I don't necessarily do that. I think there's probably some other things going on with the text itself that need to be looked at more closely.
Okay.
But getting back to the idea of why I think Molinism does a great job is because all the other views that I've ever looked at have done a poor job. For example, you said you had a friend of yours on dealing with the more the Calvinist perspective or the Reformed perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And typically we call that compatibilism when you look at it
Yep.
from a human free will perspective. And compatibilism, to me, just lapses into determinism. I honestly, personally, cannot make sense of it because if God is ordaining everything and is determining everything, then that's determinism. How do I have free will? Well, the way they explain it is they change the definition of free will, which I have an issue with.
That's exactly what Tim argued for when we were talking about it for the last 2 weeks. Yeah.
So in a sense, I don't think they're intentionally doing this, but in a sense, you could almost see it as a bait and switch because they're saying, I believe in free will, but they're redefining it. You know, they're switching the definition out on you. When I say free will, I really mean free will. I, as a person, I can abstain from a particular decision, or I can exercise a particular decision. And we call that agent causation in philosophy, and that's what I'm a proponent of. I honestly believe we have a genuine, truly free will. But if you look at Calvinism or the Reformed perspective or compatibilism, you don't get that.
Mm-hmm.
God is still ordaining everything. And to me, when you say ordain, maybe you have some other kind of definition for it, but the only one I've been able to find through my years of study is really what they mean is God's determining everything.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think some type of libertarian free will or agent causation is almost certainly true, just because if you look at how it seems prima facie obvious because we all think about our lives that way. We all proceed as if that is the case. And there's a more and less philosophically sophisticated ways to say this, but I kind of have the opinion of if myself and nearly every other human being I know perceives something as if it's true, then I think you need a very strong argument or a very strong defeater to show me that it's not true. Now, you can point to examples where that is the case, because like it might appear like the world is flat, but we've got some very good arguments and defeaters as to why no, it's a sphere.
Yeah.
But in the case of free will, I've never really heard one. It's sort of like I think if you're going to turn around and claim that we don't have it, that it's more compatibilism or straight determinism, the burden's kind of on you to then explain, well, not only why is it that way, but why do we perceive it being the other way? And to my knowledge, nobody's really done that without kind of assuming it. And if Tim's listening, he'll probably be railing against me for saying that after our discussion last time. But
well, here's the thing. I mean, I think you're right. When you have a very strong sense or inner experience of this thing called free will, that we actually really do have a choice, that I don't have to make a certain choice, and that I'm not always causally determined to make a particular choice. When we have this inner experience, as I would call it, or inner sensation, and it is so strong, and the overwhelming majority of human beings have this, I think it has something to say for it, you know? I really do. Now, can all human beings be wrong? Of course they can. But I think when we're dealing with this particular thing, if we have a theology or a philosophy that contradicts what I experience every day and like the majority of human beings experience every day, there's something wrong with your philosophy, in my opinion. And so it needs to be looked at again.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I really liked what you said about treating Molinism more as like a good theory than sort of the answer and that's it. Because I think that's a very good approach both in philosophy and in several aspects of theology, where you're going to say, well, this is my theory that I think makes sense of the data, which is both what Scripture tells us and what philosophy tells us. But, hey, if somebody gives me a better theory, I'm okay with that. I'm willing to go with that.
Absolutely.
Because they're treating it more like a theory, like in the sciences, like in physics, sort of how like Newtonian physics replaced Ptolemaic physics, and now we've replaced Newtonian physics because better theories came along. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so with all the theories that are out there, Reformed Calvinism / compatibilism, that's one of them. Then you've got simple foreknowledge, which is typically seen as traditional Arminianism. And then you got open theism. I mean, okay, you got classical theism. But when I take a look at all of those, and then I compare it with Molinism, I was just deeply unsatisfied with all those other possibilities. And so when I came across Molinism, I was like, well, maybe this is a good way to think of it. And when I dove into it and studied it, like I mentioned before to you before the recording, I spent 3 to 4 years really trying to understand Molinism because it is somewhat of an in-depth topic and philosophically rigorous, and it takes some thinking, and a lot of reading. And I came to the end of my study, and I was like, okay, yeah, I think this one does do the best explanation of the data, what we have, what we know from Scripture and what we know from as human experience and stuff. I had problems with classical theism. I had problems with open theism. I had problems with Calvinism. I had problems with the traditional Arminianism. So I said, well, then I'm stuck with Molinism because it seems to me that it still keeps free will intact while also still affirming God's foreknowledge. And so that's what I'm going with.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a chance later on to tell me what your problems are with all those other views.
Sure.
But so what I'm hearing you say is you just looked at all the views you could find, and as far as you can tell, Molinism's the theory that works the best, that either has the fewest problems or no problems that you think are big problems, I guess.
They're not insurmountable that, oh no, this can't be true. And so therefore I have to give up one of my other theological beliefs like foreknowledge or free will or something.
Yeah. One thing that I talked about a long time ago when I did a podcast last year on systems thinking is, I said, when you think about things more in a system sense rather than a linear sense, you're going to realize that every system or theory that human beings come up with is going to at least have the appearance of some problems.
Oh, absolutely.
It's going to be something that somebody can point to and go, well, you haven't really dealt with this. And that alone shouldn't make you then turn around and say, well, that doesn't work, because you're going to find that everywhere, no matter what position you take, whether it's in philosophy, theology, religion, politics, anything. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I entirely agree with you. I mean, if we think about it as Christians, when I look at Scripture, there are some troubling things in there that I don't quite get and I can't answer. But am I going to give up my faith? Well, no, because I have so much overwhelming other things that outweigh that, and that, it's a problem I wish I could figure out, but at the end of the day, it doesn't bother me because I know Christ rose from the dead and everything is true and everything's cool. Maybe one day I'll figure this other little point out,
Okay, so there were quite a few things that Peter said and went into there that I really, really liked. He gave a pretty decent pitch for Molinism there, and one of the main points he tried to make there is he tried to argue that there's no necessary connection between knowledge and causing something to happen, and I thought he gave a pretty good analogy for that with his wife and lasagna and things like that, where you can kind of say in a certain sense that you arrange things, or in a very loose sense determine somebody to do something when you really didn't cause them to do it. And I thought that was a pretty good point. And while I hope I'm not putting words in their mouths, I think several of the other guests I had on to talk about the problem of divine foreknowledge would agree with that. In fact, if I'm remembering correctly, Philip Swenson even said as much in the interview I had with him. I also really appreciated Peter saying that he goes with Molinism because he finds it to be the best theory. That is, he's not looking at it as something like a dogma or a necessary truth of Christianity like we would look at, say, the resurrection of Christ or belief in the Trinity, because I think that's a very good and healthy approach to take in these types of issues. And once again, most of the other guests I had on indicated that, yeah, they're kind of in line with that too, where they go in with the viewpoint they have because it's what seems most plausible to them, but they don't think that all the other views are like heretical or irrational or something like that, even though they think they're wrong, obviously. Now, I do find Molinism quite appealing on many levels, even though I do think there are some issues and problems with it, and I'll get into the issues and problems and how Peter and other people responded to them when I get to the critiques of all these views, which, based on how the time is going, it that's looking like it'll probably be in the two-parter of this episode. But anyhow, there's something very appealing about the idea that the answer is just that God really knows us, so he knows what we're going to do in a given scenario, because we can kind of see how we seem to have that knowledge about other people around us in our own lives. Now, after Peter, the next guest I had on in relation to the problem of divine foreknowledge was John Lee Mento, who was a guest from Indonesia, and he wanted to talk about Molinism in some other contexts. So I'm actually going to push some of the clip I've got from him back to where I'm critiquing the views, because I think it's more relevant there, and that was episode 25. Then we immediately moved into episode 26 and 27, where Jonathan Augustine Studi came on to talk about the Thomistic response to the problem of divine foreknowledge. Now, Jonathan and I have gone to the same school together, Holy Apostles College and Seminary. He's just finishing up getting his master's in philosophy there, and he's a Thomist philosopher, and a pretty good one at that. So I thought he was a good call to have come on and give us the Thomistic or the timelessness response. And when I was talking to him, one of the things I found out, which I didn't realize beforehand, is divine timelessness is kind of a misnomer, because the timelessness part of it is just kind of an artifact that doesn't really get at what the Thomistic response is. It doesn't really get at what Aquinas thought the appropriate response to this was. And so I'm going to play some clips of Jonathan and I talking about this, and I'll give you a warning, you're going to get into the metaphysical weeds here, because that's how Thomism tends to solve problems, is by getting into the metaphysical weeds. So, depending on how you think about things, you're going to view that as either a great strength, like Jonathan does, or some other people, you're going to look at it as a weakness. But it's here for you to decide. 2 points I'll just bring up to keep in mind as you're going through this is, Jonathan makes a point about how in Thomism you have to think about everything is received in the mode of the receiver. Meaning when you learn something, you have to filter it through your own mind, or something similar to that. And also keep in mind the distinction between what he's terming as primary and secondary causes. So I'll just play the clips of Jonathan and I talking here together, and there's several of them that I've edited together. Again, if you want the full context, go listen to episodes 26 and 27.
And the reason for this is that they have more closely aligned their intellect, what they know, with their will, and are able to also, by tons of practice, able to keep a cool head in those situations. And so they know what they need to do, and there's a lot less, if somebody throws a punch at me. Did this just the other day. I was teaching somebody I was working with somebody on blocking punches, and they were at first throwing just jab crosses, and I was just doing my normal little blocks. And then suddenly they threw a hook punch, and without thinking about it, or rather without deliberating about it, my will is not to get punched in the head, and my knowledge of how to deflect such a punch took over, and I tucked my hand to the back of my head and let my elbow take the impact.
You have the muscle memory that just sees that coming, and you don't even have to think, oh, here's what I'm going to do.
Right, and so by my training, I've been able to unite my intellect and my will, my knowledge of the best and most appropriate ways to respond in those kind of situations, to how I will now choose to take action in those situations. And so now with God, you see something of the same principle, that the more closely united an intellect is to that the intellect is united to the will, the more immediate the effects come about. And so in the same way that I, through my training, have been able to unite my will and my intellect, God, and therefore I don't have to deliberate, or I don't have to go through the process of whether or not I want to take an action. God, because he has the perfect unity of his intellect through his being, intellect and will through his simplicity of his being, when he knows something to be an existent, he also wills that thing to be an existent. You understand what I'm saying? Because there's no gap between his intellect and his will in Ray in itself, but it's only a division that we make upon it when we are looking at it from the outside as creatures.
So I think what I'm trying to, if I'm following you correctly here, you're saying that due to the doctrine of divine simplicity that you hold to, and pretty much as far as I can understand, every Thomistic person would hold to, what you're saying is the usual distinction that we would make when you're in your example where we'd say, oh, that's your muscle memory, and that's how we'd explain what's going on when you blocked that punch.
Sure. That
distinction doesn't exist in God.
Oh yeah, no, it wouldn't, because God's I've trained my will by habit in that sense. God doesn't have habit. God has act. He just has things by the power of his being. So it's not something that God would have to train into himself. And he's also not material, and so he wouldn't have muscle memory. But it's his.
It's an analogy, so it breaks down at some point. But yeah.
Yeah. So the analogy is essentially that my training has united my intellect and my will, and by will I talk about the deliberative way of taking particular action. And interestingly enough, I am conscious of the decision that I make, but the reaction that I have is something that I have willfully chosen. I guess kind of in the past, by my training, whether or not I should slip the punch or whether I should block it or deflect it somehow, and that's based on how I've learned to react in certain situations. So yes. So the relation is that because he's simple, his intellect and his will don't actually are not actually distinct, and so when he knows a thing to be, he also wills it to be.
Okay, I get that, but what I'm having a hard time seeing is then how that relates to the problem of divine foreknowledge, because that's going on with God then, but then how does that tie into the problem or apparent problem that God knew we were going to have this conversation 2,000 years ago, therefore we weren't free to have it or not have it?
Okay, so then the issue would be is that, and again, we are speaking metaphorically, or we're speaking in terms of our own limitation here, is that God, we wouldn't actually properly say God knew what we were going to do 2,000 years ago, because 2,000 years ago isn't really a relevant thing for God, qua God. But what we can say is that God knew before, because on our perspective, we can say that God pre-knew or had a foreknowledge, or predestined this conversation, and that in all eternity, and we can say that from temporal's perspective, because again, everything received is received according to the mode of the receiver. And so when we examine or we think about how God knows our actions, past, present, and future, we think about it necessarily in terms of past and present and future, between principal and terminus and intermediary states. But God, it's all present at once, one instant, one eternal present is what God has, and in that He sees all of salvation history, all of creation. And now God, again, if He knows what the case is, what the matter of fact, He's also causing that matter of fact. And so everything from the choices that we make, making breakfast, choosing or choosing who we're going to marry, lifting our left hand as opposed to our right hand, God is actually the primary cause behind all of that. And that without His influx of causal power, we wouldn't be making those choices at all. And so the reason why the problem of divine simplicity can seem worse for a Thomist the problem of foreknowledge and free will is worse for Thomist because of the doctrine of simplicity, and how it requires that if God knows the future, speaking metaphorically here, he's also causing the future by necessity. Does that make more sense? Does that help?
Yeah. I think I get what you're saying. If I understood you right, what you're saying is, well, it's kind of like it appears to be a problem to you and I because we are within time. So from our perspective, we look at it and say, God knew we were going to have this conversation 2,000 years ago. But if you could, in a certain sense, look at it from God's perspective, you would then not see the problem because he's not, how can I put this? He's not bound in the same way that you and I are. Am I more or less where you're going? Am I following you?
It wouldn't be a problem of temporal succession for him.
Exactly.
But the problem that I'm looking at here is that God, since He is the first mover of all things, including you nodding your head, you shaking your head, whatever it is, that He's the cause. And so, in a way, what that makes it seem as if that God is like a grand puppet master, and he's forcing us to do X, Y, and Z, and then that removes our free will.
Oh, it's an extreme form of determinism, then, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like an extreme form of determinism.
Or it sounds that way. That sounds even more deterministic than the Reformed or Calvinistic perspective that I talked with Tim Carter about a while back. At least on the face of it, it does. Now, I'm sure you're going to go on and tell me that, no, it's actually not that way as we talk about it more, though, right?
Oh, of course I am. Thomism, it has this ability to take you down roads that you didn't even know were paved. Anyway, so when God creates something, or when He moves something, say a tree, when he causes it to do tree things, the tree is going to act like a tree.
Mm-hmm.
And because the tree is a really distinct being. It's an ens, or a being per se, so it's a being in itself, distinct from God. The way that it operates is God infuses and God sustains existence within the tree, but the tree acts as a secondary cause, and a secondary cause will mediate the effect of the first cause.
What do you mean by the distinction between a secondary cause, and I assume you'd then label the other one like a primary cause?
Yeah, so I mean, let's switch up the analogy a little bit here. If I have a hammer,
mm-hmm.
and I am a human, which incidentally I am, the hammer will always be used. Will be if I swing the hammer around to hammer in a nail, I as a human am hitting the nail, and the nail is I'm driving the nail into the wood. And now I can say that both, yes, the hammer pounded the nail into the wood, and I pounded the nail into the wood.
Mm-hmm.
But I pounded the nail into the wood qua carpenter, whereas the hammer puts the nail into the wood qua hammer. And so we each have our distinct contribution to the effect of the nail being driven into the wood.
Mm-hmm.
But we're working together to bring about that effect.
And so you would be the primary cause of it, and the hammer would be the secondary cause in that instance?
Yes.
Or am I getting that backwards? Okay.
Yeah, you got that right. Yeah. And so the way that I'm swinging the hammer, the fact that the hammer is moving at all, which is I think the primary thing that you need in order to hammer in a nail, is entirely dependent on me.
Mm-hmm.
But the hammer, as actually putting the nail into the wood, that is dependent on the kind of thing the hammer is. If I use one of my son's little toy hammers, there's one with like a rubber end on it. It takes me a long time to actually hammer in the nail.
Yeah, it might not work at all.
Might not work at all. Might just completely destroy his toy. And so, in the same way, when God operates within a particular nature, or operates through when God infuses being into an essence, and gives it the power to act, He does so in such a way that's congruent rather than violent, rather than in a violent way that is contrary to its nature. It's congruent with the nature of the object, and so God moves and causes things to act according to a rock kind of action, a tree kind of action,
mm-hmm.
a doggy kind of action, and a human kind of action. And because we affirm also that man is free, when God causes man to act and moves him to make particular choices, those choices are truly free, because again, while God is the primary mover, and is the source of the man's ability to make choices whatsoever, man nevertheless offers a unique contribution at the level of essence there, where mm-hmm. he operates from those principles, and that one of those principles includes freely choosing things. And so God knows things beforehand. If we're going to kind of sum this up, God knows things beforehand, and because of divine simplicity, he also causes those things to happen. But the way that we normally think of cause in the post-Newtonian world is as if it's some sort of mechanical leverage that's like the gears in a clock. But for St. Thomas Aquinas, who is operating off of more than simply mechanical efficient causality and material causality, but also including formal and final causality, allows for a greater range of understanding how and what cause means when it comes to saying that God causes the free actions of free creatures in such a way that it's both free and necessary.
Okay. So you'd almost, if I'm following you right, you'd almost want to say, calling the Thomistic response to this like divine timelessness is at best like a gross oversimplification, because that's almost like a artifact of the view. It's almost like that it almost wouldn't even matter if it had turned out in the way Aquinas had come down on this, that he had a different view of how God relates to time.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's interesting, yeah, because most of the critiques I hear of this view will then critique, like, say, well, but taking God out of time doesn't seem to solve the causation problems, and you've more or less laid it out where you're like, well, yeah, that's kind of irrelevant. So what? That doesn't address the problem, but there's more going on.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that's the thing, is that when I read the timeless thing, I'm like, yeah, that matters, and that's why I brought up the whole introduction with C.S. Lewis, is that I've read this kind of stuff before, and calling it divine timelessness, where God knows things because all things are present to him in reality. It doesn't, like you said, remove that question of God causing things to happen, and being the inescapable cause of all things. Nothing that exists escapes his divine providence. And so the Thomist position resolves the problem not necessarily just through eternal God's timelessness or his eternality. That's an element of it, certainly, but it also solves it through a different philosophical orientation, different philosophical framework that allows for a greater range of causality within between God and creatures in the relationship.
Okay. So if I'm understanding what you're laying out here correctly, what you're saying, what solves the problem is that you draw a distinction between causation, essentially, and say, well, God's the primary cause, and we're a secondary cause through our essence, or something similar along those lines. And you then say that, and that solves the problem, more or less. Is that,
yes?
Do I got you right?
Or I'll say it alleviates most of the tension of the problem, most of the stress.
Okay. I should have. Maybe I should have had you send me notes before we interviewed, because that isn't at all a direction I was prepared for. So
nobody understands.
Good. I've learned something.
Aquinas.
But that's good. I've learned something, so that's great. In case people haven't quite followed this yet, are you able to put out another analogy of then how this would work as to why it alleviates the tension?
Sure. So I can offer the analogy that St. Thomas offers. I think it's a fair analogy. You're a clearly extremely athletic man, as are most philosophers. Actually, not the case. I started doing jiu-jitsu again after 2 years of basically focusing on nothing but philosophy, and my cardio was dead. It's all up in the head still, but man, I can't make it through the I can't make it through a full 30 minutes of free rolling, which actually I can use that analogy, but I'm not going to. Anyway, so let's say that you're walking along, and you've been walking since you were like 10 months old, 12 months old, whatever.
Probably, I don't really remember, but yeah, sure.
That's expected. Your long-term memory doesn't develop until like you're 4 or something. Anyway, but your brain is very used to walking. The motor neuron, the section in your brain that controls your muscles and the balance of your body, and the motor neurons that are firing to command your light to do X, Y, and Z. All those things are working fine. And let's say you suddenly break your leg because you have kids. Enough said. My son almost pushed me down the stairs the other day. It was terrifying. He was makes my son sound really violent. Anyway, so you break your leg, and now you stand back up because you fell down the stairs. You slipped on a Hot Wheel or whatever, and you stand back up and you start walking. Suddenly, you find yourself with an awful limp, and you can hardly move. So in this case, there's nothing wrong with your brain and with the center and with the different the neurons and the activity in your nervous system that's sending commands to your leg to move. But there's something seriously wrong with your leg. It's not quite cooperating with the way with what your brain is commanding it to do. And this is similar to what we are thinking about when we talk about God as the primary cause and the essence of man or the nature of a person as the secondary cause of a man's actions. So your brain is a primary cause. It issues the commands for the leg to move. If you did not have a brain, your leg wouldn't move, or you wouldn't walk unless you were hooked up to some sort of like draconian device that cause electrical impulses to make you move around like some sort of crazy dude. I don't know. Whatever profane things that came through our minds, we'll just go with that. We'll just ignore that for now. But your brain commands your leg to move. Your brain is issuing commands that are perfectly fine. But because your leg is now exists in a particular way that's defective, your manner of walking will likewise be defective.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the nature of God's action, he is the one who he brings whole substances into being. So the whole real thing exists. But what belongs to God in terms of his causality is he infuses you, the being, Phil, the substance Phil, with the act of existence, which is the generator and the power source upon which your essence, your nature draws in order to bring about human effects. Now, God, his very essence is existence, so there's no distinction there. He is pure and boundless. He is a pure and boundless act of existence. And because all things, because anything that's perfect is perfect only insofar as it has being, and God is an unlimited being. He's perfect in an unlimited sense, and so his command and his causality, or his command of existence and motion in creatures is perfect. But because essences are a limitation of being, there's going to be some note of imperfection, and this is where a human being can err in our knowledge of the right choice, or our will is not strong enough. But these are things that come from our essence, and they are freely chosen because, again, God is operating human beings according to the nature that we have. And so just like the brain issues perfect commands to the leg to do X, Y, or Z, but the leg nevertheless fails to walk in a straight line or whatever, so too God commands humans into being, and if something exists, it's always doing something. And so from the very moment of our existence, we begin acting in a humanly way. And once we gain full access to our faculties, that manifests itself in free actions. And so when those free actions are underway, sometimes we, because of our own human limitations, err. We make mistakes. Or sometimes we do good things. And every time we do a good thing, it's actually God's. It's actually a reflection of what God is causing in us. And the failures that we have, the missteps, the sins, the rejection of God's causal power, those things are attributed to us alone. And so we can also talk about sin in that way. The problem of evil. God cause evil and things? The answer is no, because the goodness comes from God. The goodness comes from God as a distinct, or the goodness comes from God shining through human nature. That which when a human does right, the nature glorifies God by resembling God more fully, by living out its being. Whereas when a human freely chooses to act contrary to his nature, which is what every single sin is, he also acts in a way contrary to the nature of God. And that's going to be going deeper into the nature of sin and nature of evil, which we don't need to right now. So
it's very hard when you have a good philosophical discussion to not point to all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
Okay, so I recognize that the clips of Jonathan explaining the Thomistic perspective there were quite a bit long, and I think they're actually going to be longer than any of the clips of people explaining their perspectives, because the Open Theist ones and the Simple Foreknowledge ones are not that long. But it's just so necessary to get into the metaphysics and explain so many different caveats and things like that to try to get a fair grasp of how the Thomistic answer is supposed to work, that I just felt like I had to play a lot, so that's just the way it is. Now, I've always had a really big soft spot for Aquinas as a philosopher. I think he's a brilliant philosopher, probably one of the 5 best who's ever lived, so I'm very sympathetic to any viewpoint that draws from Aquinas. But as I said, I'm going to hold off giving my full critiques and opinions of all these views until I get through presenting all these summations and key points. So next up, I was blessed to have Alan Rhoda come on and present the Open Theist perspective, and that was on episodes 28 and 29. And Alan I thought, did a very, very thorough and rigorous job of presenting open theism and attempting to defend it. Easily, I'd say that between him and Philip Swinson is the competition for who gave the most analytically rigorous presentation of their viewpoint. And so I really, really appreciated that. Alan has also published some papers in professional philosophy journals arguing for open theism, so I was very fortunate to get him as a guest and very grateful for the rigorous and thorough presentation he gave. I'm going to just go right into playing some clips of him arguing for open theism, and he does tend to use more philosophically technical language than some of the other guests I've had, but that's okay. He's a professional philosopher, so.
Right.
Okay.
If all future events exist, then the mere existence of those events serves to specify, the actual future.
Yeah,
okay.
That was one of the reasons why I am suspicious of that view of time. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So to get to a fatalistic conclusion, you need to have the existence of a future specifier, and then you also have to say that that future specifier is itself now unpreventable. Okay, that there's nothing we can do now to cause it to be the case that specific specifier doesn't exist. Okay. So the way I would state the problem of foreknowledge, or in general the problem of fatalism is something like this. It's now unpreventably the case that if this type of future specifier exists, or then this particular event occurs in the future.
Oh, okay.
And it's now unpreventably the case that this future specifier exists. So it's now unpreventably the case that this event occurs in the future.
So, if I'm following you right, we could say something, and I might trip over this a little bit, but it'd be more like if it is the case that it's unpreventable that God knows I'm going to have my cup of coffee tomorrow, then I will, and he does, and it is unpreventable that he knows that, so it is. Did I more or less get that right, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it may help to clarify by considering the possible responses that one might make. And this would help me define what I mean by open theism. And
that was Go ahead. That was going to be my next question to you, is just to tell us what open theism is. So yeah, dive right in. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, so in terms of the way I've characterized the problem, you have these two assumptions that you need to make to get a fatalistic argument off the ground. You need the existence of a future specifier, and you need that specifier to be now unpreventable. So there are two ways then to be an anti-fatalist. You can either deny the existence of the relevant specifier, or you can deny the unpreventability of it. And I think all of the responses to the problem of divine type foreknowledge kind of boil down to one or the other of those two.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So the open kind of theist takes the first route. We deny the existence of future specifiers. So what I call the open kind of future response to fatalism says that whatever type of specifier the fatalist wants to posit, it could be the foreknowledge of God, it could be God's eternal decree, it could be just the existence of some complete true story of the future. The open type of futurist is going to say that doesn't exist as a future specifier. So those, so I want to say there is no such thing as the complete true story of the future. The story is, in important respects, still is not yet wholly written. Right? And as we make the choices we do, we are contributing to that story. We are, we're not just kind of following a script that God, the divine author, has written ahead of time. We are co-authors, at least in some small respects, of the grand story that God and us are, God and his creatures are writing together.
Okay. Well, I know what a lot of people are going to want to ask then is, are you saying that God doesn't know the future, or what are you actually getting at there?
I am saying that God knows the future as perfectly as, knows the future as the future is.
Okay.
The future, I would want to say, is in some respects open-ended. If there is, in fact, no such thing as a unique actual future, right? It hasn't yet been specified, then it would be a defect in God's omniscience for God to know that, because there's no there for God to know. Yeah.
Okay, so if I understood you right, what you're saying is the future does not exist yet. I mean, in tomorrow, which is the future now, it will exist. But because it doesn't exist yet, then it's not there for God to know. So I'm sure you would affirm that God's omniscient, but he can't know things that aren't there to know because there's nothing there. Is that more or less correct, or did I mischaracterize?
Right. I don't think I would quite put it that way, because, of course, the future doesn't have to be there for God to know what's going to happen. If God could, if everything were determined, causally determined, then God could know exactly what's going to happen simply by knowing the causal propensities of things. But then we'd have a future specifier, right? In the causal type matrix of reality, there would be something that specifies exactly how the future is going to go. So the one alternative to respond to the fatalistic argument is to deny the existence of any of the types of future specifiers that the fatalist might want to posit. The future is really open-ended. Not in all respects. It doesn't mean that that the future is completely like random or something. Things like eclipses and things are presumably causally determined to occur, and we can predict them with near 100% accuracy and stuff like that. But some things are not determined, and some human choices are among those. And so in those respects, the shape of the future has yet to take form. So open theism, to my mind, is a view, well, of course, it's a version of theism, so we affirm the existence of God. We affirm the existence of God of what I like to call a broadly kind of classical sort. Exactly what means by classical theism is somewhat debated, but not the classical theism of high Thomism or something like that. But,
they have a very unique conception in many senses. So,
but we believe that God created the world ex nihilo, and that God can unilaterally intervene in the world as he pleases. We believe that God is unqualifiedly omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent. If you're a Christian open theist like myself, you want to add that God is a triune and things like that. And but that's not essential to be an open theist, to be a Christian open theist. But
I didn't know there were non-Christian open theists. That's interesting.
Yeah. So we're theists of a broadly classical sort, and by that I just mean that we want to distinguish between open theism and process theism. They share some common ground, but the folks in the process camp are very clear that they want to deny creation ex nihilo, and they want to deny that God can unilaterally do anything in creation, right? And I just reject that. That if you affirm that, you have stepped completely out of Christian orthodoxy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. Yeah.
So as far as the open part of open theism, we're going to want to say that the future is genuinely open-ended. There are multiple futures that are causally possible. And because of that, God knows the future as open-ended. So, and I would say that there is no diminishment of either the sovereignty or the omniscience of God on open theism, at least as I would characterize it. The future is precisely as open-ended as God has sovereignly allowed it to be. And God and his knowledge of the future is open-ended precisely because the future is open-ended, and God knows things as they are. So there are some open theists, such as Bill Hasker, who take somewhat of a different line. That he wants to say that there is a complete true story of the future, but it's not knowable by God, by anyone.
Yeah.
I reject that line because I think he runs into the same types of grounding issues that the alchemist does. And I don't think there's any kind of reason to say that. It opens the open theist up to an obvious type of line of objection, like you have a diminished view of God's knowledge.
Yeah. As I recall, when I was reading your essays, Richard Swinburne takes a similar view to that. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, he does as well.
Okay, so that's Alan's presentation of open theism, and I'm well aware that I'm really, really pushing on time here, so I'm just going to wrap this up. Next week, I'll do part 2 of my wrap-up of the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge, and I'll start with Philip Swenson's presentation of the Simple Foreknowledge view. Now, in the meantime, as always, write and let me know what you think. If you already have any thoughts or feedback on the whole little project I did on the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge, well, it doesn't really seem like a little project now, since it took me like 6 months, and there's all this material to go through. But in the grand scheme of things, there's people who've written gigantic books and articles and stuff on this. So in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty little project compared to what other people have done. Anyhow, write and let me know what you think. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or contact me over the Facebook group, The Examined Life with Phil. Just search for that, you'll find it. If you like what I'm doing on the podcast, give us a rating on any of the podcast sharing sites like iTunes or iHeartRadio or any of those other ones. It should be up on all of them as far as I know. And if you really like what I'm doing here, share the podcast on Facebook or social media so it gets out to more people. Help the podcast grow if you enjoy it. So thanks again for listening, and I'll be back next week with part 2 of my wrap-up on the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.